Welcome to the Hughes, Hubbard Anti-Corruption and Internal Investigation Practice Group's podcast, All Things Investigations. The Hughes, Hubbard Anti-Corruption and Internal Investigation Practices Group represents many of the premier companies around the world, providing advice on issues spanning the full anti-corruption and compliance spectrum. In this podcast, host Tom Fox and members of the Hughes, Hubbard Anti-Corruption and Internal Practice Group will highlight some of the key legal issues involved in white-collar and other investigations, both domestically and internationally. We will tackle topical issues involved in investigations, as well as explore how companies can prevent and detect issues that arise in conducting investigations on a worldwide basis. Today I'm joined by Mike DeBernardis. We take a deep dive into how companies can navigate doing business in high-risk jurisdictions. It's a fascinating exploration of how you can do business in some of the riskiest places in the world with some of the riskiest state governments and foreign officials. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, back again for another episode of the award-winning All Things Investigations. Thrilled to have back with me Mike DeBernardis. Welcome back, Mike.
Thanks, Tom. Happy to be back talking with you on this feed.
Mike, I thought we might take things in a little bit different direction today in two areas. Number one, Hughes, Hubbard, and Reed has Month in a Minute developments in anti-corruption newsletter that goes out each month. And I was really intrigued this month because all three of the stories were about individuals who either worked for PDVSA or had worked or were from Venezuela and corruption convictions. And first of all, so I wanted you to tell us about Month in a Minute, tell us about each of those, and then maybe use that to talk about how do you do compliance in high-risk areas. And we'll get into that when we finish, but I just thought this would be a great way to explore. We've talked about the law a lot on this podcast, but how do you do it? So with that, tell us about Month in a Minute.
Yeah, I'm happy to and glad to. It's a good opportunity to do it. So it's as you know, it's a monthly publication, and I use the term publication loosely because it's the whole point and design of this resource is to be short. I mean, initially when we came up with the concept, it was hopefully able to be read in a minute. It ends up being slightly longer than that usually, but the idea is to give you the latest FCPA related developments in a very short, concise, digestible format. And we try to put it out as quickly as possible once the month concludes. And so you can sign up for it on our website or reach out to me. I'm happy to get you signed up, but it's a good resource. And it's also helpful, honestly, for our team in staying up to date and identifying things that you just identified. I mean, it just so happens that this month, the developments we highlighted all related to PDVSA corruption. 3 separate developments in individual prosecutions for individuals involved in various ways in what I think would be considered a much broader endemic of corruption within PDVSA and probably within Venezuela, although these cases all relate to PDVSA. And so just briefly, the 3 cases, one was related to the case against a gentleman named Paulo Casquero Murta, and he was sentenced in the Southern District of Texas, actually to just 1 year supervised release and a monetary judgment of $105,000. He was a Swiss Portuguese, I think he was based in Switzerland, financial manager. And so his role in these various schemes was actually in laundering the proceeds of the bribery for Venezuelan PDVSA officials. And he admitted ultimately to facilitating the payment of $25 million in bribes to PDVSA employees and helping to conceal those payments through offshore bank accounts and hide them through various transactions. His case is very interesting and long. and actually has a lot of interesting jurisprudence on FCPA because it was dismissed and then reinstated by the circuit. It's sort of a roundabout case, but it has ultimately come to a conclusion. Another that we highlighted in the month of a minute is the case against a gentleman named Luis Fernando Vutev, and he's an Argentinian financial asset manager, and was alleged to have engaged in a similar scheme, although his role was similar, although it was a slightly different scheme, where he and some co-conspirators helped take advantage of a flaw, a gap in Venezuela's currency exchange system. Essentially, they were Venezuela. The Venezuelan government was valuing the Venezuelan bolivar much higher than the market, and so these individuals were purchasing U.S. dollars at a certain price, or other currencies at a certain price, and then basically purchasing bolivars at a certain price, and then basically, through a series of kickbacks and schemes, getting reimbursed at a higher price. And for his role, he was indicted ultimately in 2022, and ultimately admitted to setting up shell companies and bank accounts that allowed co-conspirators to access, I think, more than $500 million in profits from this and other corrupt schemes within PDVSA and throughout Venezuela. His co-conspirators included some very top Venezuelan officials. And finally, we had a sentencing against a former PDVSA official himself, Cesar Rincon. Mr. Rincon was a former PDVSA official that was sentenced for conspiracy to commit money laundering. He was alleged to have solicited bribe payments from PDVSA vendors in exchange for oil contracts. So he was, we're often on here talking about the companies bribing government officials. Here's an example of a government official himself, who was prosecuted. Obviously, he can't be prosecuted under the FCPA, but was prosecuted for money laundering. He concealed the proceeds of his bribery scheme through wire transfers that went through the U.S. And in the U.S. Ultimately had to forfeit $7 million as part of his sentencing and guilty plea. So to your point, I mean, it's sort of happenstance that these were the three developments in May, and they all involve PDVSA and in some way or another. But it is a nice opportunity to sort of talk about how companies go about doing business with entities that have a history or reputation for being very corrupt. Because the reality is, these are three examples. I think more than 20 people have been prosecuted for various schemes, but there are plenty of companies that have done business without engaging in corruption.
Before we move to that next topic, Mike, I'd like to highlight Rincon just a few moments because he has been in the FCPA world and news since at least 2018. He solicited bribes from two separate companies, took in over $17 million in bribe payments, but he actually flipped and he cooperated with the government. And that led, I think, directly to his sentence after 6 or 7 years of time served. So he got off relatively lightly. He did, of course, have to forfeit the money, and he cooperated with the investigators. And it really speaks to what you can get if you do cooperate, no matter how nefarious your conduct was. And you and I often talk about this in the context of corporations and either declinations or discounts, et cetera, for overall fines and penalties. Well, it's the same is true for individuals. And at one point, I thought Rincon was about the worst of the worst. Well, he may have been, but he made a heck of a comeback. And I think it speaks directly to what the government will value and what they want. So for him personally, I thought he came out really well based upon the conduct that was reported in his original plea agreement.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think, now, look, he had to forfeit the proceeds, which is, they're going to expect of any individual or company that's sort of making a mea culpa. And he ultimately spent 6 years on house arrest. Now, that's certainly better than spending any time in a federal prison. So, but all those things were taken into consideration. I think you're absolutely right. It's I think a very positive result from where he was, in 2018 when this story first broke.
Well, the coincidence of having those three stories in this month's newsletter really struck me as a great way to introduce what I wanted to talk to you about, which was you get a call from a client, or a client says, Mike, come down, could you meet with our CEO? We've got a great new business opportunity. And you come into the meeting and they say, we're going to go to Venezuela, caveat that you can do business with Venezuela under U.S. trade export in caveat. Or you name the country, Nigeria, Kazakhstan, China, whatever it may be that's high risk. And we're going to do this for the first time. And we really want to do it because we think we can make a lot of money, or we have a potential for a contract. How do you help craft a risk management strategy to allow them to do business ethically and in compliance, and equally importantly, stay on the right side of the FCPA? How do you help a compliance officer, a GC, or even a CEO really think through the steps of a high-risk jurisdiction?
Yeah, it's a great question, and this comes up. I mean, this is not one of these type of things, not with PDVSA at the moment, because as you mentioned, there's severe restrictions there. But it does come up. It has come up for me a number of times throughout my career. And I think the first thing that I try to do is explain that this can be done, right? And it's depending on the client, right? Sometimes they're coming at it from the situation of, hey, I got this BD guy, he wants to do this. This sounds insane. We can't possibly do business with PDVSA, right? Or sometimes you have the opposite effect of, we're doing this, let's go, we're ready to go, and there's nothing that's going to stop us, right? And the answer is, of course, there's nothing that is going to stop you. There's nothing preventing you aside from trade sanctions type stuff. The answer is we just have to do it carefully and do it in a strategic and planned out fashion from a risk management perspective. So it's always that first conversation of saying this can be done, but you have to recognize that there's certain things that we have to do to make sure it's done safely. Otherwise, you are really sort of increasing your risk level in engaging with these types of relationships, transactions. And then you really go about, at least I do, assessing the risk. So not all situations create the same level of risk, right? So you can do certain business with one of these entities in a very public and open, straightforward procurement process, and you submit your papers, and you either get the bid or you don't, and you move forward. That's on the lower risk spectrum. If we're engaging third parties to help us, navigate the complexities of the procurement process, and or have sole source situation, the risk level increases. And so we want to sort of understand that, kind of do that initial risk assessment with the opportunity kind of early on. And then it's a matter of risk management in action. So for me, it's going to depend on the circumstances that I mentioned, but almost always it involves some level of specific training for the individuals involved in the opportunity about the risks. If it was an opportunity with PDVSA, we would go through some of talk about. There's plenty of examples here where people have tripped up, and frankly, it'd be an easy training to do because you've got a lot of people heading to jail for their parts in various schemes with PDVSA. And then it's after sort of doing that educational piece, engaging in some manner of controls. So I prefer to put something, put in place kind of what's necessary, nothing more, nothing less, to manage the risk. And that might be specific payment controls. It might be having a compliance officer sort of involved in all business communications, involved in all meetings. We've gone as far as sometimes to set protocols to say nobody's allowed to have a one-on-one conversation. Every business conversation that we're going to have with our counterparty or third party related to this opportunity has to have at least 2 people from the company. We're going to keep minutes, and we want to sort of make sure that there's no misunderstandings. Obviously, payment controls can be very important, making sure things are documented, all the normal pieces. And really, at that outset, you really want to explain to the client, hey, look, this is important that we do this. It's also likely to slow things down a bit, at least at first. So you have to be prepared with respect to timelines to understand that to do this right, we have to do it carefully.
So I want to pick up on 3 things. First of all, and a first for the All Things Investigations podcast, you have given us the name of the podcast in your remarks. This can be done. So kudos, you get an extra gold star. Number 2, actually what I heard you say, Mike, was a business process. And I'm going to see if I can translate that into compliance speak, which was risk identified, assess risk, put together a risk mitigation or risk management strategy, train your employees on it, and implement. And now you start to work because you monitor and you improve, remediate, tweak as appropriate. The other thing, or the third thing I heard you say was, as the risk increases, you increase your risk management strategy. So you specifically mentioned having more than one person in a meeting if necessary. And might that slow things down? Yes, it might. But it also might provide an additional level of risk management or protection that wasn't present before. So when I know I've articulated that in a business process, but when you explain that process, is that something business people understand, sort of, even if they don't understand this kind of specific compliance speak or kind of the underlying legal reasons you might want to do it, but do they understand that process?
I think so. I mean, in my experience, 99% of the business people at clients that I'm dealing with want to do stuff, but they also want to do it correctly, and they want to do it safely. And especially if you're giving them a training that includes examples of a bunch of people going to jail, they certainly want to do it without going to jail. So there is that understanding. I think sometimes the mistakes that compliance professionals, either internal or external, make is simply saying, no, we can't do it. That's too risky. We can't do that. And I much prefer to come at it from, let's see if we can find a solution. And I think business people respond really well to that. Like, we can do this, but X, Y, and Z have to happen first. And of course, there's going to be, during the course of it, there might be pushback, and you're going to have to sort of, have constant reminders, that this rule about having 2 people in every meeting, you're going to have a situation where somebody goes ahead and has a meeting with only one person, and you have to have a discussion and sort of course correction on that. But in my experience, business people absolutely understand this idea of risk tolerance, risk mitigation, and increasing that mitigation based on the risk. They deal with it all the time in other contexts, other sort of risks, non-FCPA related risks, business risk, currency risk, whatever it might be. So this is not a new concept.
The early on in my compliance consulting career, I had the following happen to me. I was in a office of a CEO, and he described for me what he wanted to do. And I said, well, you do that, you might as well get fitted for an orange jumpsuit. And he looked at me and said, wait a minute, you're the lawyer, you go figure it out. And when I thought about it, I realized he was 110% right. It is our job as lawyers or compliance professionals to create a framework that businesses can do transactions ethically and in compliance. And if that means your risk is incredibly high, fair enough. You put in a high risk management strategy. The second thing, early on in my corporate career, a guy told me, said, well, if I don't go offshore, I'm not going to have the risk of the helicopter crashing and dying. And again, we don't get the job, and we don't make any money. And what I learned from that, Mike, was that number one, he was absolutely right. But number two, if the risk is higher, potentially the profits are higher.
Mm-hmm.
Now, once again, as you correctly said, it may mean you have to take longer to get to that profit point. You may have to actually spend more money in your risk mitigation strategy. But there's a reason why people don't build $500 billion gas plants on the beach of any country, because simply the weather risk is so high. But if somebody does it, they may make a lot of money because they may be able to take product out of the ground and deliver a refined product more quickly and efficiently and get it on a ship and get it transported out. Once again, you could have a big weather related risk. So I really like the way you have helped us frame not only the issue, but the answer, which is talk to the business people and understand what they want to do, and then go back to your office and do what you do as a lawyer, do what I do as a compliance consultant, figure out how can we put controls or a strategy, training, implementation in place, but then controls to monitor that strategy. And as you just said, if a course correction is needed, you do a course correction. Doesn't mean you were wrong. Doesn't mean anyone's wrong. It was just a course correction based upon the data that you've obtained through your ongoing monitoring. And I think that at least the more I find that I present that to business people as a solution for high risk, they go, well, yeah, that's what we do. That's what we have to do in every situation. Do we do that formally? Maybe not, but that's the steps that they go through. So they're very comfortable with that. And then I just have to end with the Tom Fox mantra of document, 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 because you may have a regulator knocking. And if you show them these steps documented, I think that's exactly what they're going to respond to in terms of, oh, okay, yep, you had a risk, you assessed the risk, you put a strategy around it, you trained on it, you implemented, you monitored, and you improved based upon the data that you got in. And that's exactly what the regulators want to see. So I guess maybe as we move towards the end of this podcast, that last part about how do you think through either documenting something or presenting it to a regulator, whoever that may be in the U.S. or the United Kingdom or others, of the steps you've taken. How would you help a client think through that preparation process?
I'm glad you brought that up, because I think it's important to document the plan itself. Here are the steps we're taking here are the risks. Basically, we've done an assessment. Here are the risks we see. Here are the pressure points. Here's our risk mitigation plan. Here's what we're doing. The steps we're taking specific to this project, whatever that may be, and then document the actual steps taking place. Okay, and I think that is a process that will be respected and understood by a regulator as the correct way to handle a difficult, risky endeavor. Now, how you present that to a regulator depends on the circumstances, but having those materials at your disposal to say, look, we did this risk assessment, which everybody says the compliance program has to be risk based, and we should be putting our resources into riskier areas. That's exactly what we did here. We put into place this risk mitigation plan based on the risks we identified. And then we followed through on that plan. And then we made adjustments. And each step of the way, we've got documents showing it, whether that's emails, formal memos, policies, whatever it might be. I think keeping all of that in a file, however you sort of keep your documents, is a very valuable resource, not just for responding to government regulators, but it also allows internal, external auditors to better look and make sure you're following your process, right? Let's say we're putting this process in place, and in 12 months, we're going to have our internal audit come and audit to make sure it's being followed. Internal audit, because you have all this documentation with what the plan is, and hopefully as you're implementing it, it makes it for a much easier audit, and makes it, if you want to do the same with an external auditor, it makes it much easier, and that's additional support and risk mitigation. So that from that perspective ends up being a feedback loop. But I am glad you raised that because I think your mantra is especially important here. Document, document, document.
Well, Mike, unfortunately, we're there at the end of our time for this episode, but thanks again. I look forward to continuing this conversation.
Thank you, Tom.
This is Tom Fox again. Thank you so much for listening to this part 2 of this special 2-part podcast series where we looked at economic sanctions and trade controls in the EU and from the European perspective. I hope you will join us again for our next episode of All Things Investigations, and that you will subscribe, rate, and review wherever great podcasts are listened to. The award-winning All Things Investigations is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.